Good afternoon. Again, John Piccarelli sends his regrets, but a sick child takes precedence over a presentation. I've been asked to talk about radicalism, violent extremism, and lethal means of violence. I've been given 20 minutes. To give perspective, not too long ago, I attended an FBI school for 5 days on this topic and barely scratched the surface. Very complex. I'd like to start off with asking you to think about several points of focus. The first one, as it relates to data and research. Members of most radical and extremist groups are not known for their willingness to participate in research or add to the body of knowledge. So a lot of what we know and we put forth is based on a different type of research than we're used to and a whole lot of assumptions. I'll also ask you as another point of focus to think back to Daniel Webster's comment about the adolescent brain and the development of the adolescent brain and the age of those people, mostly kids, who are engaged in extremist, radicalistic, terrorist behavior, whatever you want to call it, on the front line. They're young people. Third, and very importantly to the discussion and understanding these groups, what we have in most nations, and here in the United States, are people in fixed positions, sitting in fixed places, working with fixed laws and fixed processes and fixed budgets, dealing with people who have no traditional boundaries, no restrictions, and an almost unlimited willingness and ability to change. Tough environment. Another thing that sets us apart from our earlier conversations today is that in the commission of acts of violence, we tend to generalize to the group or the group's leader and rarely to the actual perpetrator of the violence. Another point of focus, and this is a tough one, based on current headlines and recent headlines, is that I ask you to advance your thinking, or in fact revert your thinking, so that we don't just focus on global extremism or religious extremism or terrorism, but also consider gangs and cults and militia groups and others. There's some things we can do to change our thinking right away. We started the day this morning, Patrick did, if you remember, referencing the horrible act, the terrorist act, the extremist act against innocent children. When we refer to acts of that type, in regard to radicalism or extremism or terrorism, we use those terms, a radical act, an extremist act, or a terrorist act. Please help me to change the thinking. It's murder. It's homicide. I'll even go so far as to say, help us change our thinking in regard to suicide bombers. They are not. They are homicide bombers. It changes our focus, just with a few terms. As much as I can, I'm going to be true to some notes that John left. So I'll go back and forth between what I know and what he did. And I'm going to close with some of the research that the Justice Department is putting forward right now. To talk about the complexity of this issue of lethal violence committed by radical groups, extremist groups, it's important for you to know that if you go on the web, look at the research document, there are over 100 definitions of violent extremism. Some of the common threads in these definitions, and Evelyn touched on some of them. It's violence, it's the use of violence and the credible threat of violence by a group, generally for a political or other collective purpose, against a group. The targeted group almost always, not always, but almost always, includes non-combatants, or again, to change the terminology, innocent people. And the targeting of the non-combatants is really quite deliberate. The groups work to maximize fear and psychological impact. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about the change in thinking about how these groups attack and for the purpose. But it's interesting that only some of the definitions among the more than 100 cite these acts as criminal. They tend to cite them more as political or nationally driven or lots of other reasons, but they don't cite them as crime. Now, by way of a quick history, prior to the 1990s, in history, we looked at extremist groups in several categories. Anarchist groups. In fact, the role of the Secret Service was changed from being a financial investigative organization to include a protective responsibility as a result of the assassination of President McKinley by an anarchist. It was ethno-national radicalism and extremism that actually drove World War I, our country into World War I. Ideological extremism, a lot of that associated with acts during the Cold War, fascism, communism. But things have changed since the 1990s. Today, we're more concerned with ideological movements that are often associated with religious movements. And it's the combination of the two that make this discussion very complicated and very difficult. The groups that we're talking about generally, the ones that are grabbing the headlines, and even some of the smaller ones located within countries, including here in the United States, believe that they can affect major transformation within the society based on their beliefs and acts to perpetuate their beliefs. And in fact, some of them believe that they can transform the world. They convince people within the groups that carrying out the acts of violence can lead to some form of martyrdom, or, the ones that aren't necessarily religious related, some form of heroism. They find salvation, the members of the group find salvation in an unwavering commitment to and willingness to die for the cause. The means they use, go back to the very first slide we had up this morning. Guns, bombs, fire, machetes, torture, rape, starvation, dislocation, aggravated assault, poison, and more. They obtain their means, the tools of the violence, through other than normal channels, sometimes supported by nations that support their ideology. So we can't take down the gun dealers to stop these groups. In the 1960s, most acts of extremism or radicalism were designed to attract the attention of political leaders and to disrupt economic systems. That advanced through the 90s to some larger events designed to create political backlash, to draw the attention of global media, national media here in the United States. But what changed since the 90s is that the mass casualty events and the violence used to cause those events those acts have been committed regardless of public sentiment, regardless of political sentiment, and regardless of backlash. These groups, and the thing that makes it very difficult, is that they are disconnected from neighborhoods, communities, states, and even nations. So they don't fit the mold in regard to how we can combat them. And I use that term very carefully. I'm very opposed to using the word combat relevant to drugs and homicide. We in law enforcement are not at war. But in regard to these groups, we are, in many cases. It is combat. But because they're not aligned to a neighborhood or a city or town or a state or even a nation, the question we have to put forward that's hard to answer is who's in charge of getting them? Here in the United States, we even have conflict among the different organizations charged with responsibility of minimizing and defeating terror. So what's been going on? The Justice Department has put forward a great deal of research, and the Department of Homeland Security going back to the terrorist attacks of September 11th. In 2012, the research changed some to look at more of the global extremism and radicalism than was originally put forward, where we focused on terrorism. The terrorism being heavily politically driven as opposed to the extremism and radicalism we're seeing today, which no one can really define well in regard to purpose or intent. One of the things that the research that is emerging is showing, some of it will be no surprise to you, is that the violent extremism we're dealing with is driven by people in the same group that have various grievances. All the people in the same group are brought together due to a common cause, but within the group have very different purposes, very different grievances they're trying to address. There's no consistency within the groups based on age, socioeconomic background, education. You have wealthy, you have poor, you have uneducated and educated in the same group. NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, today to sponsor 19 studies of these groups. And much of the research is out and about on the internet. Some of the findings. We know very little. It's one of the findings. That the more we delve, the less we know. That the intelligence organizations are not as collaborative as we'd like. And in some cases are even competitive. That information that is available isn't shared to the degree that it could be shared, although it's shared much better than it was. The University of Maryland is looking at studies on fact, has 24 studies going. Looking at some of these groups and organizations, and I found some interesting things. In terms of demographics, and this is very interesting, people committing the violence in these groups. The age has dropped significantly. The number of people who have been caught, their age has decreased 4 years between 2001 and 2007, and another 6 years between 2007 and today. We're dealing with young kids committing some of these acts. Social media has played a tremendous effect on causing people to join these groups and in pushing them to commit acts. A really interesting piece of data. At one time, it took 2 years to nurture someone into a radical group and get him or her to the point of committing an act of violence. I apologize, I said 2 years. 6 years to nurture the person. That has now dropped to 2 years or less. In a survey done, a study done of one group in the United States, predominantly Somalis, in Boston, the Boston area. 2 scales were used, and they found that 41% of the people who were tested could easily be led into radicalism. And I have the names of the scales if you need them. So where do we go? We need to change our thinking. We need to look at how communities can play a better role in identifying these people and reducing the potential for young adults to get involved and for young adults to feel so comfortable with delivering acts of violence on a grand scale. We need to give law enforcement more access to the information that exists so that they can intervene with these kids at an earlier age and get more focused on prevention than reaction. We need to change our terminology. I mentioned a couple of things already. I'll give you another example. We have spent hundreds of millions of dollars teaching our enforcement agencies to deal with active shooters. What is an inactive shooter? We've warped our thinking. And finally, and there's much more I can get into, but I'm at the end of the time. We need to help, and this is very complicated, help our enforcement agencies and others involved in this area understand, our educators too, that radicalism and extremism are not illegal in and of themselves. We've come to think that. It's confused our enforcement and our intervention. Police don't want to take action for fear of being accused of profiling. And the proper term should be inappropriate profiling. They need to profile appropriately based on good information, good intelligence. They should never profile inappropriately. So we need to quit using the term profiling and start talking about inappropriate versus appropriate profiling, and get others within the community involved in appropriate profiling. Identifying people who, based on certain action, are at risk of committing certain acts, and then making contact for intervention. There's much more in John's information that I know he would have shared. So forgive me for not being able to get to it all. We had no slides to share with you, and there's much more we need to do in this area. As I said, it's very hard to even address in a short period of time. But the one thing I'll close with is there is no research, and not even editorial comment, that shows that we're coming any closer to bringing radicalism, extremism, any closer to an end. And much of the research shows there's more to come. You see that in the headlines. Part of it is we have not come together as a community yet to address this, in part because people don't know how. There's much we can do. Thank you.